The sky above Virex 11 shimmered in electric shades of violet and gray, a deceptive beauty masking the planet's cruel nature. One by one, students materialized across the rocky basin, dropped via teleportation from orbiting cruisers belonging to their respective academies. The sudden materialization left some disoriented. Others, instantly on edge. A shrill wind rolled over the jagged terrain, carrying fine particles of orange dust that stung the eyes and hinted at the chemical volatility of the atmosphere. Somewhere behind the mountains, the day star flickered dimly, barely piercing the dense cloud layers that boiled overhead. Ava Monroe stood alone on a rocky outcrop, her boots crunching softly against mineral dust as she scanned the land. She was the only human selected for this year's Intergalactic Survival Exchange, an honor only granted to one Earth cadet every solar cycle. Her body tensed slightly from the teleportation, but her mind was already racing with assessments. No trees in the traditional sense, but towering stalks with sponge-like canopies dotted the horizon. The ground was uneven and sloped downward into what appeared to be a dry ravine. Flat stones, some cracked and layered, littered the area. The air smelled metallic and faintly sulfuric. The others were beginning to orient themselves. Groups of 2 or 3 alien students clumped together instinctively by race. The Zenthari, scaled beings from Raylon Prime, hissed to each other in their guttural tongue. The Flurns, fragile beings with bioluminescent skin, hovered just above the surface, scanning for safe landing. A group of rigid, cubic-bodied Droll Knights unfolded metallic appendages and began emitting diagnostic pulses. Amidst all the alien life, Ava's presence seemed strangely small. Yet she held herself with quiet command. Her fingers tugged at the worn strap of her canvas field bag, empty except for the basic survival pouch permitted by the instructors. A high-pitched tone blared across the sky, emitted from a satellite drone that hovered just out of reach. Then the professor's voice came, simultaneously translated into each student's native language. You have been placed in Zone X-17 of Virex 11. The storm cycle begins in 12 local hours. Acid rain, electrical surges, and wind events are expected. Objective: construct sustainable, non-technological shelter before. You may not share materials, tools, or designs. Observation has commenced. As the drone zipped away, Ava sighed. She had studied Virex 11's patterns during the selection process. 12 hours was not much time, especially on a planet with unstable weather fronts. Acid rain here wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. Chemical burns, gear corrosion, soft tissue degradation. Most alien species relied on environmental shielding or symbiotic tech, but that was forbidden during the trial. The others didn't seem to understand that yet. Some groups began wandering off in search of what they called structural mass. The Flurns floated toward a shimmering quartz formation, hoping to mold something from its surface. The Droll Knights argued about geological stability. The Zenthari dug shallow holes with their claws, seemingly intent on burrowing, but Ava had no intention of joining them. She walked calmly down the ridge and into the basin, scanning the environment like a tracker. Her eyes picked out key materials, the fibrous vines dangling from tall stalks, flat mineral plates thin enough to lift, and strange foam-like growths that formed naturally at the base of hollow tree shapes. She crouched and tested the vines, surprisingly strong, tensile and not sticky. She sliced one with the sharp edge of a rope and coiled it like rope. Next, she tested the sponge foam. It compressed easily under pressure and rebounded after several seconds. Excellent insulation, she thought. While others were still arguing or theorizing, Ava was already planning a wind-redressed frame, using rock slabs as walls, bound with vine lashings and lined with foam for internal buffering. She knew she needed to get the frame up before nightfall, when temperatures dropped and wind speeds accelerated. From a distance, one of the Droll Knights watched her with an optical sensor, then scoffed audibly in machine speech. "Primitive behavior," he said in translated form, loud enough for others to hear. "The human has reverted to sticks and stones." Some students laughed. Even a few humanoid scholars from the moon of Caldris pointed at her as she bent over a pile of mineral plates. Ava heard them, but gave no reaction. She had learned a long time ago that the wild didn't care about mockery, only preparation. Her father had taught her how to build a debris shelter in the Rockies during a whiteout. This was no different. The rules of nature were universal, even across galaxies. By midday, she had erected the base structure, Two long stalks formed an X-frame against the wind, anchored by heavy stones. Mineral slabs leaned on either side, forming a crude triangular tent. Foam growths had been collected and pressed into wall gaps. She used vines to lash joints together and added horizontal braces to stop lateral sway. It was no palace, but it would stand. The others, meanwhile, had barely made progress. The Xanthari had clawed a trench that filled with toxic runoff. The Flurns were attempting to mold a reflective dome, but kept burning their hands on unstable crystal. A group of insectoid students had formed a hive pile but argued about its collapsibility. All around her, trial and error reigned. Mostly error. By late afternoon, the sky darkened. A shift in wind pressure signaled the storm's approach. Ava stepped back from her structure and checked it for tension. The roof plates clinked slightly in the breeze, but the frame held firm. She dug a shallow moat around it to redirect runoff, then slid inside and sealed the entry with a slab. As the first gust of sulfur wind howled through the basin, carrying particles that hissed against exposed skin, students began to realize the gravity of the challenge. Panic swept through a few clusters. Two Flurns cried out in pain from early burns. A Drollnite unit attempted to deploy a shield and was immediately disqualified by an overhead drone, which zapped his unit badge and teleported him off-world. Ava lay inside her shelter, arms crossed, breathing steadily. The air inside was warmer, stiller, and smelled faintly of plant oil. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her body rest. Outside, the planet began to rage. Inside, the human was ready. The first strike of acid rain landed with a sizzle against the mineral plates, followed by a sharp hiss that rolled across the surface like a warning. Ava blinked in the darkness of her shelter as the sounds intensified. Outside, the winds howled in chaotic spirals, lifting dust and chemical residue into thick, suffocating plumes. Her shelter shuddered once, but the bindings held. She adjusted her position slightly, feeling the heat from her breath reflect back onto her face from the foam-lined interior. The faint scent of damp vegetation clung to the air. She had made it in time. Ava reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small strip of ration gum, a tasteless but calorie-dense survival chew she'd been issued. She bit down and closed her eyes, focusing on the vibrations that trembled through the frame of her structure. Rain slapped at the mineral roof like claws. Somewhere nearby, she heard someone scream. The sound was sharp, desperate, and cut off quickly. Ava did not move. The storm had only just begun. Outside her shelter, chaos unfolded. The Flurns, glowing bodies now dim under the acidic onslaught, tried to huddle under a translucent sheet of repurposed leaf matter. The acid had already begun eating through it. One of them bolted in blind panic, only to slip and fall into a shallow ravine where chemical runoff surged like a muddy river. Another followed, only to vanish from sight as a gust of wind picked him off the ground and hurled him into the air. Neither returned. Not far from them, the Xanthari attempted to reinforce their trench with slabs of broken crystal, but the unstable materials snapped and released vaporous bursts of noxious gas. The largest among them, a warrior cadet named Krar, roared in frustration and clawed at the ground until his talons bled. His scaled skin was already blistering, small holes forming where the acid hit directly. He threw one of the broken slabs across the field, narrowly missing a student from another race who shrieked in protest. The trench, shallow and exposed, began to flood with glowing blue water, toxic and searing. One by one, the Xanthari were forced to retreat from their own construction. On the far side of the basin, a Drollnite had constructed a vertical scaffold made from assembled rods of lightweight metal mined from a previous exercise. It stood tall and proud, an impressive feat of engineering. But the moment the wind reached its peak velocity, the structure began to sway. The bindings, designed for tension in gravity-stable environments, weren't meant for horizontal shock. With a groan of metal, the entire shelter collapsed in on itself, burying the builder in a shallow grave of his own making. A faint blinking sensor on his collar signaled emergency extraction. Seconds later, a beam of light flashed down, teleporting him off-world in failure. Ava kept her breathing steady. She shifted once more to check the lashings along the interior wall. The vines had swelled slightly from the moisture, tightening the knots even further. She smiled. Earth knowledge, she thought, worked in places even the galaxy misunderstood. Her shelter was not just surviving, it was thriving under pressure. Hours passed. The storm worsened. At one point, acid runoff began seeping into the entryway, so she reached for a flat slab she had saved earlier and wedged it against the door, forming a crude seal. She used her forearm to sponge away the moisture and pressed herself deeper into the corner. Every instinct told her to stay low, stay calm, stay alert. By what must have been early morning on Virex 11, the storm shifted from rain to wind. Violent, bone-rattling gusts ripped through the basin like invisible blades. Some shelters exploded into pieces, sending debris flying across the dark sky. Ava could hear the anguished cries of students who had assumed the worst was over. The wind wasn't just fast, it was intelligent, curling around structures, probing weaknesses. She pressed her back against the far wall, counting the seconds between gusts, and then she heard it. Footsteps. Someone was outside. At first, it was just one, dragging footfall, slow and limping. Then another. A few seconds later, she heard soft banging on the mineral plate door. "Please, please let me in." The voice was strained, almost unrecognizable, but unmistakably female. Ava didn't move. She waited in silence, listening. The wind howled again. Another knock came, this time harder. "Human, I know you're in there. Let me in, I beg you." Ava hesitated. She knew the rules. This was a solo challenge. Interference meant disqualification. But rules meant nothing if someone died. She moved the slab slowly, letting in a sliver of moonlight. Through the crack, she saw a Flern, the smaller of the two who had fallen behind. Her glowing skin was pale, parts of it blackened from exposure. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, filled with terror. Ava opened the door just enough for the Flern to crawl inside. The alien collapsed immediately, shivering uncontrollably despite her natural heat retention biology. Ava resealed the slab, wedged it tight, then turned and checked the foam insulation. The shelter could hold two. Barely. The Flern whimpered softly, curling into the opposite corner. "Thank you," she whispered. Ava nodded but said nothing. The silence returned, broken only by the muffled screams of students outside. The Flern wept quietly, and Ava leaned back, staring at the roof. She wondered how many would survive the second night. Outside, the acid rain returned in pulses. The wind changed direction. Debris rolled past the shelter in thuds and cracks. Another student pounded on the wall, begging, clawing, but Ava could not risk structural collapse. Her shelter wasn't made for three. Hours crawled past like wounded animals. By the time light returned to the sky, filtered and dim though it was, the storm had started to ease. The wind dropped, the rain slowed. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was grim, funereal. The ground was littered with the remains of half-built shelters, scorched clothing, twisted limbs of structures and students alike. Ava did not move. She waited, she watched, she listened, and she knew this was far from over. When the winds finally died and the last drops of acid rain hissed into silence, Ava sat motionless inside the shelter, listening. The air was unnaturally still. Not a single voice echoed across the basin. Even the Flern who lay curled near her had stopped crying, her breath shallow, as if afraid any sound might trigger another storm. Ava peeled back the mineral slab that covered the entrance, just slightly, and a rush of damp, sulfur-tinged air flowed into the confined space. She blinked, adjusting her eyes to the eerie gray morning light. Outside, the landscape had transformed into something unrecognizable. The ground was soaked in shimmering patches of chemical runoff, steam rising in thin wisps where acid had burned through alien fabrics and flesh. Scorched fragments of shelters lay strewn across the area like the aftermath of a battlefield. In the far distance, a collapsed dome of fused crystal sparkled in broken shards. Ava's gaze moved slowly, methodically, cataloging what remained. Two Zinthari forms lay motionless near the flooded trench, their scaled skin mottled and blistered. A droll knight stood alone by the remains of his scaffold, arms folded across his cube-shaped chest, his once pristine casing now marred by deep burns. A few others wandered aimlessly, dazed, burned or limping. The survivors, Ava stepped out. Her boots sank slightly into the softened terrain. The wind was gone, but the silence was heavy, almost accusatory. The others noticed her the moment she emerged. The droll knight turned first, his glowing ocular node narrowing in calculation. Then one of the humanoid cadets, a tall, golden-skinned being from the planet Ixaris, stepped closer, his tone brittle. "You had shelter," he said. "You knew this was coming. You built that thing and said nothing." Ava kept her voice calm. "Everyone received the same instructions. I just prepared differently." The Ixari's eyes flashed. "You let us suffer. You could have told us how to build it. You could have helped." She met his gaze evenly. "And you would have listened?" He didn't reply. A second voice cut in, quieter but no less pointed. The Flurn, now outside and sitting weakly near the structure, spoke up. "She let me in. She saved me. That's more than anyone else did." Ixari turned away, but tension hung in the air like smoke. Ava knew what was coming. The desperation in their faces had shifted. It was no longer about survival alone. It was about pride, about the instinct to assign blame when pain became too much to bear. More cadets began to approach. A Grothan female with four-jointed arms and pale, cracking skin stepped forward. Her voice was dry and rasped through a damaged throat. "What's inside that shelter? Is it still warm?" Ava nodded. "Somewhat." The Grothan tilted her head. "Then I'll be joining you tonight." Ava's expression hardened. "The shelter holds two." It already held more weight than it was meant to. Another person could compromise the frame. It won't hold through a second storm. "You can reinforce it," the Grothan replied. "Not with what's left," Ava said. "I used the last of the viable foam and slabs before nightfall yesterday." "Behind the Grothan," others murmured. A group of cadets clustered together, forming a loose semicircle. Ava noticed Krar, the Zenthari warrior, dragging his wounded leg behind him as he approached. His left eye was swollen shut, and strips of burned skin flaked from his neck, but his posture remained upright, his pride intact. "She has the only structure that survived," he said slowly. "And she dares tell us it is closed to others?" Ava's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you it has limits." Crawford let out a low, growling laugh. "Then perhaps we test those limits." The moment stretched. The crowd shifted, closer, tighter. Ava stepped back toward the entrance of the shelter and placed her hand on the mineral slab, half guarding the door. She glanced toward the Flurn, who now sat frozen in place, eyes wide with fear. The mob wasn't united yet, but it would be. Soon. A sudden crack of thunder rolled across the sky. Heads snapped upward. A new storm front was visible far in the distance, darker, thicker, and moving fast. A dust wall rose ahead of it, blotting out the horizon. The cadets stiffened. Time was slipping away again. Ava made her choice. "You want to stay alive?" she said loudly, addressing the group. "Then start working. The only reason I survived is because I started before any of you stopped talking. I'll show you how I built the frame. I'll even help you find what's left of the foam. But no one touches this shelter, not unless you want to bring it down on all of us." There was a pause. Some eyes narrowed. Others showed recognition. A glimmer of survival instinct returning. Then the Grothan nodded once. "What do you need us to do?" Ava pointed toward the edge of the ravine. "Search the sponge stalks for anything that hasn't been burned through. Look near the roots. That's where the good foam collects. Krar, you're strong. Pull mineral plates from that collapsed ridge. But check for corrosion first. If it steams, leave it." She turned to the Droll Knight. "Your sensor still works?" "It functions," he answered. "Then map wind direction. We'll need to angle your shelter differently. That side of the ridge catches the gust first." He blinked twice. Agreement. In minutes, the basin shifted. The cadets dispersed in different directions, retrieving what materials they could. Ava worked fast, returning to her shelter and tying down one side more securely with a recovered length of vine. The Flurn helped her, fingers shaking but willing. As the others gathered what they could, Ava noticed something change. No one mocked her now. No one laughed. No one questioned her instructions. By the time the second storm rolled in, 4 additional shelters had been half completed. Not beautiful, not perfect, but functional. Ava circled each one, inspecting joints, correcting lashings, stabilizing frames with scavenged metal or mineral slabs. The last of the daylight disappeared under swirling black clouds. She returned to her shelter just as the first acidic drops fell. She sealed the door. Inside, the Flern already sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, silent. Ava crouched and pressed her back against the wall again, listening as the wind screamed anew. The shelter held. Again, and this time, others had a chance to do the same, because she gave them one, but she also knew what came next. When the storms passed, when they were all still alive, gratitude would fade, and resentment would grow. The storm lasted nearly 16 hours. Ava had measured the passage of time by the rhythm of the wind. It came in waves, low howls that grew into howling roars and then collapsed into guttural silence, only to start again minutes later. Inside the shelter, the Fleuren lay curled, whispering a chant in her native language that Ava didn't understand. Ava pressed her forehead against the mineral wall, feeling the structure tremble every few minutes. Her joints ached, but she remained alert. Sleep was too dangerous. A single shift in wind or a drop in pressure could mean collapse. She had built the shelter with intention, but it had never been tested under 2 back-to-back storms. Now it was. When silence finally came, it did so gradually, like the breath of the planet slowing to a halt. The first sign was the absence of impact sounds against the walls. Then came the muffled drip of acid water sliding down smooth surfaces outside. The air grew heavier, but calmer. Ava opened the shelter door carefully, shielding her face in case of residual vapor. A mist of pale steam rolled inward, but cleared quickly. She stepped outside into a world of muted destruction. Around her, the basin lay buried beneath layers of chemical residue. The soil squelched underfoot, saturated and soft. Smoke rose from several failed shelters, their frames half melted or blown apart. She saw movement, figures emerging, staggering, coughing, blinking into the new morning. The Droll-Knight stood intact near a rebuilt cube, his casing still smoldering at the edges. His scaled skin cracked but healing. A few of the others were missing. She didn't ask who. The Fleuren emerged behind her, her hair limp and skin darkened at the edges but alive. She looked at Ava with a strange blend of gratitude and fear. Ava didn't speak. She walked past the others and toward the ridge to survey the damage. 4 shelters had survived in fragments. The 5th had collapsed entirely. She found one of the Ixari cadets lying unconscious nearby, his breathing shallow. She knelt and checked for burns. His limbs had shielded most of his torso. He would live, but only barely. By mid-morning the wind had shifted again. It no longer carried threat, but something colder. Suspicion. Ava could feel it when she returned to her shelter. Her name was whispered now, but not with respect. She saw it in glances exchanged behind her back, in the way conversations hushed when she passed. The cadets had survived, but not because of themselves, and some were beginning to remember that too clearly. Krar approached her just before midday. His steps were slow, weighted by fatigue and pain. She expected a demand. Instead, he offered something far more dangerous: politeness. "We would like to meet," he said. "A discussion. All who remain." She tilted her head. "A meeting?" He nodded. "To plan the final day. We do not know what the last trial will be. We should speak before it comes." She stared at him. He waited. Finally, she nodded once. "Where?" "The south edge, near the ridge." Eva followed him there half an hour later. The survivors had formed a semicircle, seated on stones or crouching in the dirt. The Droll-Knight was present, as was the Grothone, 2 Fleurns huddled together. The Ixari male she had argued with stood slightly apart, his arms crossed. Krar began. "We were not prepared for this environment. That is clear to all of us now. We lost many, some due to ignorance, others due to arrogance. But we are here, and we must choose what comes next." The Droll-Knight's voice buzzed softly. "There is no further instruction. The drones have remained silent. The test may already be complete." "No," said the Grothan. "There is always a final phase, something decisive. The galaxy does not grant survival alone as success." A murmur of agreement followed. Krar turned to Ava. "The human gave us knowledge. She gave us shelter. She could have remained alone, but she did not. And now she holds the only shelter still functional. Ava tensed. The Ixari took a step forward. We want to reinforce it, improve it, make it central. If the final trial is exposure, only that structure gives us a chance. That structure was not made for all of us, Ava said calmly. You can redesign it, he snapped. Not without dismantling it entirely, she answered. A silence fell. The cadets looked at one another. The implication was clear. The Flern, who had shared the shelter, spoke timidly. She helped us. She saved me. You want to tear it apart? We want to survive, the Ixari said coldly. Krar looked at Ava. We ask for your cooperation. She held his gaze. And if I refuse? Krar didn't blink. Then the decision will be made without you. Ava stood still, feeling the weight of every eye on her. Her shelter was more than a structure. It was the symbol of who had been right when others had failed. And that, she knew, was intolerable to those who couldn't bear their own mistakes. She nodded once. You have your meeting, but the shelter stays as it is. You want something better? Build it. Use what I taught. You have the knowledge now. The Ixari's jaw clenched. She thinks she still leads. I never led, Ava said. I just stayed alive. She turned and walked away. No one followed. Behind her, the voices grew louder. That night, the sky was quiet, but tension hung in the air like smoke before a lightning strike. Ava slept with one eye open, a stone blade in her hand. She knew the storm that mattered now wasn't the one that came from the sky. It was already inside the camp, and it was waiting for her to lower her guard. Ava didn't sleep. Not fully. She rested with her back against the shelter wall, eyes half closed, one hand curled around a sharpened bone blade she had shaped earlier in the afternoon. The Flern lay nearby, silent, barely moving except for the rhythmic rise and fall of her breath. Outside, the air hung thick and unmoving. The sky, once violent and unpredictable, had calmed into a heavy, featureless dome of dark gray. No birds, no insects, no weather. Just waiting. Something in the stillness felt wrong. She heard the footsteps before she saw anyone. Soft, deliberate, and too many to be casual. The ground outside shifted, the sound of boots against wet dirt pressing closer to the shelter. She remained still. Then came a knock, not a frantic plea for help this time, but 3 even, deliberate taps. She rose to her feet, silently motioning to the Flern to stay put. She pressed her palm against the slab that covered the entrance and listened. Ava! It was Krar. His voice was quiet but clear. Step outside. She didn't move. I am not alone, he added. Of course he wasn't. Ava opened the slab slowly, careful to keep her blade at her side, half hidden behind her thigh. Outside stood Krar, his massive frame towering, his reptilian face still marked by burns. Behind him stood the Ixari, arms folded, gaze locked with hers. A few others lingered in the shadows, watching but not speaking. The droll knight was absent. That detail registered immediately. She stepped out, but didn't close the slab behind her. If the Florn needed to run, she wouldn't trap her inside. What is this? She asked flatly. Krar spoke. We've decided. The shelter must be shared. It will be restructured, redistributed. You can assist or you can step aside. And if I refuse? She asked. The Ixari answered this time. Then we take it without you. Ava studied them. Their postures weren't aggressive yet, but the tension was coiled. She could see it in the way the Ixari's fingers flexed, in how Krar's claws dragged through the dirt without him noticing. They were done pretending to negotiate. They had made their decision long before arriving at her shelter. This was just performance. Formality before action. She took a step forward. You've had time. I gave you instruction. I helped build 4 other shelters. You want more protection? Reinforce those. But this is mine. I bled for this. I planned it. I didn't sleep for 3 nights because I was listening to every gust, every tremor, every weakness in the frame. You don't get to walk up now and claim it like you earned it. You would rather watch us die? The Ixari said sharply. I'd rather watch you build your own salvation, she snapped. Silence fell between them. Krar inhaled slowly through his snout, then exhaled in a low rumble. So be it. He stepped forward. That was the trigger. Ava moved first. She didn't wait for the others to attack. She lunged directly at Krar, not to wound, but to disrupt. Her shoulders slammed into his side with enough force to throw him off balance. He roared in surprise as he stumbled backward. In that same motion, she spun and struck the Ixari's forearm with the flat of her blade, forcing him to drop the rod he had been hiding in his cloak. Then, everything erupted. 3 cadets rushed toward the shelter. Ava darted to intercept, slashing one in the leg with her blade. The cadet howled and collapsed, grabbing his thigh. Another tried to tackle her, but she ducked and rolled, coming up between him and the shelter door. She shouted once, "Go!" and the Fleurin inside scrambled out the back, disappearing into the thickening mist beyond the ridge. Krar recovered and charged. Ava braced herself, holding her blade high. But at the last second, something else happened. A beam of golden light cracked across the sky. It came from above, silent, blinding, and final. It struck the center of the basin like a hammer. Everyone froze. The ground shook. Dust and wind scattered in all directions. Then a second beam followed, slower, wider, descending in a spiral around them. This was no storm. This was extraction. Above, a massive shadow emerged. A ship. Its engines silent, its design sleek and cold. Drones appeared from underneath it, scanning the area with a grid of blue lights. One by one, cadets were enveloped in columns of light and lifted from the ground. Krar stepped back, blinking. The Ixari looked up, stunned. No one had expected it. No one had been warned. Ava remained standing, blood dripping from a shallow cut on her forearm, her blade still in hand. The final trial, she realized, had already occurred. It wasn't survival, it was the aftermath. One of the drones hovered directly in front of her, scanning her vitals, her movement, her surroundings. She stood still. A few moments later, a panel on its surface flashed green. A voice echoed from above. Cadet Ava Monroe. Trial completed. Shelter integrity 94%. Combat reaction optimal. Leadership deviation measured. Compassion ratio balanced. Extraction authorized. She didn't move until the beam locked onto her. As the light enveloped her, she looked once more at Krar. He said nothing. His face was blank, but his eyes burned. The Ixari had already disappeared, lifted into the sky like a prisoner swallowed by judgment. Then she was gone. Lifted smoothly, silently. Above the carnage, the broken shelters, the fractured alliances. Inside the ship, she was greeted not by applause, but by silence. Rows of observers stood behind glass, instructors, evaluators, architects of the test. One of them, a human woman in a blue uniform, stepped forward and offered her a bottle of water. Ava took it and drank. Her throat burned. "You held the line," the woman said simply. Ava said nothing. "You'll be assigned to a diplomatic corps," the woman continued. "You'll be the only human in a 5-member coalition. That trial? It was just the beginning. Those students? They weren't your enemies. They were your future allies." Ava lowered the bottle. Her voice was hoarse. "Then they'd better learn to build their own shelters." The woman smiled faintly. Outside the window, Virix 11 grew smaller, shrinking into a storm-shrouded dot as the ship pulled away. Below, the planet waited for the next trial, the next group of hopefuls who thought survival meant outlasting the storm. Ava now knew the truth. The real test came after the skies cleared.